Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Shop Talk, I think number 8.
Yep.
If you're not familiar, this is a reoccurring series thought up by, I think, the wonderful Erin, who wanted to have a panel for writers, marginalized writers that don't just talk about being marginalized and actually just talk about their craft and what it means to be a writer. And I'm pretty excited to hear what we can glean from Elizabeth, who Erin will introduce actually. So let me let me not step on your toes, and let me just introduce Erin, and then we'll get to it. Um, Erin H. Aceves, he/him, is a bisexual Mexican-American writer born and raised in East LA. He graduated from Harvard College and received his MFA from Columbia University. His fiction has appeared in JMWW, Epiphany, and Them, among other places. He currently lives in Texas, where he serves as an early career provost fellow at UT Austin, and his first novel, This Is Why They Hate Us, is coming March 29th, 2022 from Simon & Schuster's Books for Young Readers, which is super exciting. I'm going to hand it off to Erin in a second, but I just want to remind everyone, please be respectful, and also that you can pre-order Erin's book or order any of Elizabeth's work through the Astoria Bookshop website, and you can ask questions using the feature down there that says Ask a Question. All right, I'll leave you to it.
Thank you so much for that intro, Laura. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Shop Talk, Marginalized Creators on Craft. As you know, my name is Erin, and I'm your moderator tonight. And I'm talking with the indescribably brilliant and accomplished Elizabeth Acevedo. Elizabeth Acevedo is the New York Times bestselling author of the Poetics, which won the National Book Award for Young People's Literature, the Michael L. Prince Award, the Pura Belpré Award, the Carnegie Medal, the Boston Globe Horn Book Award, and the Walter Award. Well, she's also the author of With the Fire on High, which was named a Best Book of the Year by the New York Public Library, NPR, Publishers Weekly, and School Library Journal. And Clap and You Land, which was a Boston Globe Horn Book Honor Book and a Kirkus finalist. She is also behind Inheritance, a visual poem, which comes out May 3rd of this year. It's a lot to get through that bio. It's just you're just so like so many.
It feels so good.
It's all stuff you've done. But hi, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for being here.
It's such a pleasure. I mean, I'm so delighted. I remember we were emailing back and forth, and I was like, if you ever want to talk shop, let me know. And then, I have this whole thing called Shop Talk. I'm like, oh, let's do it.
Yeah, no, oh my God. It's been a long journey with this sort of interview series. And I always thought you were perfect because you do it all, like you have so many avenues that you just do so well. And I'm so curious about, writing as a writer, but also just as a reader. Yeah. And so, yeah.
Thank you. I'm delighted to chat with you. I can't wait to hear some of your thoughts on, the different ways that we approach world building and how we create these characters. I hope that it's not, just me talking at you, and that we can generate some great thought partnership here. So delighted to be talking with you.
Right. Okay. Well, if you want to hear me talk a little bit, I can inject that into the questions. I'm sure people wouldn't just for you. But so my first question is, starts at the beginning, and it's about inspiration. So the way I feel about this is when I'm writing, I sort of have two modes, and one of them is I call them drop-ins, and it's like when a line or an exchange, a dialogue sort of just drops into my brain, and it's one of those things where I have to run and write it down before I forget it, because it feels like it's not really coming from me. It's more of a channeling sort of thing. Yeah. So I call that drop-ins. And then the rest of what I do, I call stitching, because it's like drop in here, but what happens in between those two things? I gotta stitch it, right? So I'm wondering if it's similar for you, if it's totally different. How do you write? What's your inspiration for, and I'm sure it's different every time, but if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, no, I love the language you have around drop-in. I think that feels very similar. I mean, some of the language that I've also heard that feels true is this idea of like downloading, that there's like, there are times when I'm not sure if something has just been percolating, or I've been thinking about it, or maybe dreaming about it, but it's not fully at my consciousness. And then I sit down and go write, and it's like, I'll get 2 or 3 pages, and I'm not quite sure where it fits or what it's supposed to be doing, but it exists almost as its own whole. And then I do this, I do call it stitching, actually. I think of it that way. For me, primarily because I began writing through poetry and in verse, it was very difficult at first to figure out how to create a narrative. Like I had multiple pieces on like my character's name, on her reflection on church, or on her mom, but they were very separate. And I kind of had to teach myself, you know, how to look for plot lines through what is a lot of interiority. And in general, I tend to write a lot of really reflective pieces, and then need to remind myself that the character is living in the world. And so I began writing the Poetics and didn't finish it. Got 40 pages in and realized I need to learn how to write a novel before I can figure out how to write a novel in verse, because I need to teach myself how fiction functions, right? And so I started with The Fire on High, which is my second book and is prose, but also ended up working very similarly in that it's like these episodic reflections, and then the character is out in the world, a lot of exposition, and then we're back inside. And so that kind of taught me what it was that I wanted to be doing with verse. And so I returned back to the Poetics. I had by that point figured out this like back and forth that I was doing, but it's very much stitching. And I would say that in most of my verse novels, there's probably 10 poems, and then everything else is a hinge between those actual poems, or like, you know how when people play jazz, it's like the musical stylings. I call them like their poetic stylings between these more complete pieces.
Awesome. That's so interesting. I think I remember though, because I listened to all of your interviews, and I think I remember you saying that you finished with The Fire on High before you actually, you know, went back to the Poetics, which is similar in a little, in a way, except my With the Fire on High is This Is Why They Hate Us. I was about to finish what would be my third book. And then I sort of cheated on it with this idea, or not really an idea. I had the voice of Quique, and I wrote it really quickly. And I was like, oh, I need to get back to that other book. That one's going to get me my agent. And then it totally didn't. And then I went back to, so like,
I had a fantasy novel that a lot of people don't know about. It was like 350 pages. I spent like 4 years working on it. And I was also like, this is going to be the thing. That drawing was basura. And so not getting me the agent, not doing anything. But I think sometimes you have to get out the novel that doesn't work, and like teach yourself the things you're really good at and the things you're still struggling with, and then like clear the plate for the next project. So I almost think of it as like that was the rubble I had to sift through to then arrive at like, okay, now I have a better idea of how to build this thing. Like, but I had to really struggle with this other project. So, you know, I'm curious how many of us have these like manuscripts, not that yours was trash, but just like these manuscripts that did not end up being the first. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Exactly. No, and that's so great to hear, because I'm like, you know, if you just wrote the Poetics, like your first novel, I would be like, why does she get to, like, oh my gosh, that's so great to hear. Speaking of the Poetics, so you mentioned that you sort of had to write a novel before you wrote a novel in verse. Let's pretend I know nothing about novels in verse. What is a novel in verse, right? Like, it's, if someone was really mean and, you know, didn't really know art, they would just say, oh, you're hitting enter a lot, right? Like, so like, what is the, you know, especially I think in high school, a lot of poetry, they're like, rhyming is great. But if it doesn't rhyme, like, what's the skeleton of sort of a novel in verse?
Yeah. I mean, I think, and it's interesting that you mentioned that the Poetics went out to auction, and there were, you know, several people interested, but there were a few folks who didn't bite, didn't want to participate in the auction, which is like fine. But I remember someone saying like, this just feels like broken up prose, right? And we always remember the critique more than we remember the compliments. But then I had to sit back and you know, kind of like think through what it was that they were sensing. And I think that sometimes it is kind of what folks believe they should be looking for in a poem. So I would say a novel in verse is that, right? Like, it is not a novel in poetry, it is not a novel in poems, it is a novel in verse. And verse, as opposed to prose, is something that is rethinking the shape of the sentence, is rethinking how sound and imagery and these poetic sensibilities affect the trajectory of how the poem moves, right?
Mm-hmm.
For me, I had to be really thoughtful about what are the last words I end on every single line in a piece of verse. What does the shape look like on the poem? When do I omit punctuation in order to create momentum? And then, like, the character is running, the character is out of breath, so the reader is out of breath. When do I make sure that the enjambment is working in such a way to really create contrast so that the reader can feel like there's tension, because there's tension literally within the images and the language, right? How do I make sure that, especially in a novel in verse, you don't have a lot of dialogue, right? Because it's incredibly cumbersome to put into place. And so then you're relying on a different way to get across character and voice. And you have to be really strategic about, how do I get across how this person sounds if I'm not doing too much dialogue? It has to be in the few words I do pick for them to say, or in the cadence of their language. So a lot of meter and thinking of, you know, breaking iambic pentameter so that the ear is jarred. And so for me, I approach a novel in verse very much like with the same skill set of how I would approach a single poem, and using all of these tools, but then also remembering, like, it is a story. The character has to go to the bathroom, the character has to eat breakfast, the character has to get her period. Like the character has to exist in such a way that a character in a novel would, where they're the mundane details, it's not just all in her head. And so I think that's the back and forth you're constantly moving, that the language is held at such a high caliber, but also then has to be matched by the actual story. And I would say most prose, you want the language to be that way, but often it can be considered purple, or it can be considered, you know, too attempting to be too poetic, right? In a way that the verse allows for an elasticity of, like, I can play with images and words and repetition that prose would not allow. So I would say that leaning into all of those different kinds of methods and tools and like elements, that's what makes it very different than prose.
Yeah. So I reread Poetics for this, because the first time I read it, it was just for story, right? And I was so wrapped up in the characters and everything, but I was more analytical this time, or at least I tried to be. Again, I was enveloped by it, but I tried to be like, okay, look at this, like like you're studying it, and it was just, it was so, like, it was so eye-opening to look at it that way, because you have poems or chapters in the book where I remember I was looking at one, and every line ends with a period. Mm-hmm. And that is so different from no punctuation, from a comma, from, right, like, and the shape of some of the poems, especially, they one of them I remember is like a diagonal, like across the page, and I'm like, and that coincides with how the character is feeling, and it does create this tension that's not just from what's happening. And I just it's so sorry, I'm too excited. All right, so let's move on to so your second book, but the first book you ever finished, With the Fire on High, which is written in prose, right? We have chapters, and I'm curious about how you approach the prose, because you still have this obviously ear for rhythm, and you have this the slang that's so natural, but I'm wondering how you approach that, coming from sort of the verse and the poetry.
Well, because I hadn't sold it, it was kind of a secret project that no one was checking for me as a novelist. I could be wildly imaginative. I could play with the thing on the page. I didn't really know what I was doing. I mean, I read a bunch of novels in verse, but I felt what I was resisting in those books and what I wish I could do differently. But I took a lot of wild gambles that I was prepared for editors to say, like, you can't do that. And then they did it. And I was like, oh shit, y'all are gonna let me do this? Then I'm gonna do this. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think that there is something incredibly joyous and freeing in the first novel because there are often zero expectations. And so you can do some things that surprise even you. And I think that often what people feel when they read the Poetics might be that there was just a freedom there, that I had no audience in mind. I had no idea that it would ever, what it could be, As for with the Fire on High, similar to how you mentioned that Quique came and started talking in your ear, that's how Imani came. It was National Novel Writing Month. I was supposed to be working on this fantasy novel. I was in my MFA for poetry, and then this character just starts talking in my ear, and I'm like, girl, I ain't got time for you. Like, I don't write prose, so like, you gotta go somewhere. But the character felt fully formed. Like it felt like she came. And it sounds mystical, right? Like this idea of characters arriving, but just that my brain was able to put together a composite of someone that felt really interesting and like someone that I knew, and like, okay, how do I take this character who loves to cook and loves the Food Network and wants to be on Chopped, and who do I know that she could be mapped onto? And then I started thinking of students I started thinking of cities that inspired me. And like what cultures I wanted to celebrate. And that book came about, in that way. And it was wildly different. The Poetics was pretty much untouched plot-wise. Like that book had sat for a while, and my editor and I worked on it, of course, but it was in really great shape. With the Fire on High had just all kinds of things happening because I was driven by the character, but then there were so many possibilities, right? I think with the Poetics, it felt inevitable what had to happen. She has to end up on stage, and she has to end up confronting her mom, right? With the Fire and I'm like, does she go to Spain? Does she move? Like leave her baby? Does she take her baby with her? Does she find a dorm that has allows mothers to come? There was so much that could happen. And so I had to make choices that weren't necessarily what I would consider downloading or like at the level of just art, but really at the level of craft of, okay, what do I want to say here? And so this might feel a little bit cumbersome because now Elizabeth Acevedo, the person, has to kind of step in and say, there are choices that I need to be making that align with a specific thing that I am saying. Yeah. And I think sometimes when we write and we're like, it just came out like this and it was magic, and so I don't judge it. It exists in the world. It's different when you're like, it came out to a certain point, and then I had to be very strategic about all of the things that happened in order to say blank. And that was a little bit more of an engine with the Fire on High. Like my needing to say, all right, I want to talk about the single mom who is co-parenting and what this that she doesn't get exactly what she wants. It doesn't look super glamorous at the end, but it does feel fulfilling, and it does feel like she went after something that she was told she couldn't, right? Yeah. And that there's magic, like that it's not a book that is just about the tragic life of a young mom. It is a book that also celebrates her ability to say, I'm shifting the narrative. Yeah. Yeah, like literally shifting the narrative. There was so much I wanted that character to do, and I'm like, I gotta, it has to fit.
Yeah. Well, I started teaching this semester for the first time, and you have all these kids coming in, and they're adults technically, they're undergrads, but they're kids in my mind. But they come in with these stories, and they're so ambitious, and they're so sort of like, when they haven't been, not warped, but they haven't been affected by like the realities of publishing. Yeah. And like there's such a beauty in that. But one thing that I try and help them with is, and they sort of make fun of me for it because I keep saying this word, but it's logistics, right? And it's the idea that there's a reality. If you're writing contemporary, there's sort of this reality that you have to react to and take into account. And with the Fire on High, right, there's so many realities for Amani to sort of think about. It's like she has her child and she has her passion and her family, and so
she has to catch the bus on time, and she has to like make sure she remembers the details of like, you know, different schedules. That's part of writing too. I don't know if your editor is like this, and you didn't even ask a question. I'm just going to talk. But my editor was meticulous to the point of I had to look up flight schedules from Philadelphia to Spain, and she's like, "There's no flight that would get them in at that time. So how are they going to actually get to Sevilla?" And then I had to look up buses, right, to say like that it is actually possible that the world that I am saying worked matched the timetables. Right. And so that was
kind of editor, not your copy editor.
That was my editor.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. That's.
Yeah. So like I had bus schedules. I had flight schedules. Okay. So if she has co-parenting on these 2 weeks, like she would email, like she emailed me like, oh no, she can't actually, unless something happens, Malachi Tyrone won't have the child that day because her parenting is this. Like we had a calendar of her co-parenting. So it was a level of detail of the functioning of the world that I think I hadn't really imagined, but really taught me like, oh, these pieces like need to work in order for the rest of it to feel real at that level. Like, even to the schedule, you know, this is reflective of what real life is.
It was actually, now that you mention it, it was my agent who made me write a schedule, a calendar. And she was the one who was like, okay, you know, end of school, we're also dealing with Ramadan. We're also dealing with like 4th of July when it like, so.
Because it takes place over the course of the summer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
like, you had all these real life details that you have to be like, okay, how am I accounting for? And do they celebrate this? Do they recognize this? Do they acknowledge it? Do I, as the writer, make a point by saying, we're not going to talk about XYZ? Like, I think those choices are fascinating. Whenever I read a book and it's set in the fall, and I'm like, there was no Halloween, there was no Thanksgiving, there was no like, like what is that political?
This book is anti-Thanksgiving, which probably yeah. Awesome. I'm also, this is a small thing, but it just kind of jumped out at me. You name your titles in With the Fire on High. You sort of you name your chapters. Like we don't have chapter 1, chapter 2, like we have Cafe Sorrow. You know, like I was wondering about that choice because it's sort of, it is a little bit atypical in young adult to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I was told that it was more typical in middle grade, but because again, I was trying to teach myself how to really wield prose, and I also am a stickler for how I want sentences to sound and poetry to sound and chapters to end. Like I'm very particular on the ending of every chapter feeling like a real button and like a stop point. My chapters tend to be very short, very self-contained. And so I had it numbered, and then I was like, chapter 175. I was like, this is nuts. Like I did not feel great being like, people are going to be reading, and on chapter 99, like that felt OD to me. So I was like, they have names. I think it actually will stop the reader less. They are less aware of like, how far am I in this, or how much is left, or why are these chapters so short, or this book feels like it's for really young readers because the chapters are so short. And so it just allowed for the heading, similar to the Poetics, almost as if it were in verse. The heading is a part of the poem, is informing, is offering information that maybe you don't get in the chapter, or is cluing you into the takeaway in a way that like, okay, let me hold on to this as I read. So that was really my instinct there, but it just had to do with the numbers. It looked horrific, and I couldn't stand the sight of, I had it in Roman numerals, and then I was like, this got really complicated.
Oh my God. That's so funny. But I find sort of across the board, people do like shorter chapters. Like there's something about the momentum of it that they really like. I remember the first book I ever wrote, I used, what was it? I used dates. And then, but one of the chapters was, I think, 8,000 words. So it was like 40 pages of one chapter. And sorry?
Oh, I just said, wow.
Oh yeah, no, that's a good reaction to that. But I've toned it down a little bit, but sometimes I do get a little carried away and I write like a really long chapter.
I love that though. Yeah, I'm just thinking of like
how did I do 8,000 words? Yeah.
Well, pacing, right? Because I think that says something. If you have, it's similar to if you have a really short sentence, and then a long one, it stops a reader. It says, oh, something here that is happening different, and I need you to pay attention. So if the pacing of chapters are very short, and then you have this section, I would imagine there's something that's being clued to me, or that I'm supposed to be, oh, okay, something happened here. Well, we can't break this up. So like, it has to be as a reader, I would be like, okay, hold on, let me slow down and pay attention because the writer did something different. You know, we departed from what the pattern was. So I was mostly just being like, ooh, should I write a 80?
I think you can. I really think you can get away with it. I just, if, you know, the reader would trust you, but the reader should not have trusted me when I wrote that first book. It was
too much. It sounds like you didn't trust you.
I should not have. Like it really, I learned from that. But
fair.
Yeah. So last question about With the Fire. Well, not the last question, but With the Fire on High, you mentioned all this research that you had to do. I'm also wondering about, you know, sort of the research about the character Mani, of like her racial, ethnic background, the city of Philly, Spain, like being there, and you know, all these things that, you know, you've talked about the other research, but like this as well. Like, how did you go about doing that?
Yeah, so I think I had the idea for Imani, and like, okay, she's going to be this young woman. I had been teaching in Maryland, but when I trained, my teaching program took place in Philadelphia. In the school that I taught at, I taught 12th graders who had failed 12th grade, and so needed the summer school in order to get their diploma. So they were almost on their way out, right? I was one of the last stops that they had. And I got to really engage with these, you know, 17, 18, 19-year-olds. And at this particular school at Frankfurt, they had an incredible culinary arts program. And in New York, I didn't know any school that had a culinary arts program at the public school level. Like that wasn't, we didn't even have home ec. We didn't have any type of home sciences, no kitchens, right? And so I was just like, yo, Philly's dope. Y'all learn to cook. I wish I had learned to cook. And then I learned that there are the Philadelphia school system had a lot of technical programs, right? And still maintain those technical programs. So when I had this idea of this young woman, I knew I had to base her in a city where this idea of pursuing culinary arts in high school would not only be possible, but would be known to her. She would know that that was a possibility. And I thought back to Philly, and I thought back to those kids, and I thought back to, like, I had 3 teen mothers in that, you know, in that summer school program when I was teaching, and it felt like, okay, I think there is something here about what I know about that school, about what I know about those students. And I remember talking with Evie Zaboy, who wrote Pride and American Street and was the editor for Black Enough. And she was kind of like, you know, I'm trying to base some of my books outside of New York. I feel like New York just has so much play in terms of stories. And so for me, it was kind of like a challenge of, well, I spent this time in Philadelphia. My partner's from Philadelphia, so we go back pretty often in the Philadelphia area. Maybe it would be really interesting to write about the city that a lot of people know, but maybe don't know this angle of it. And then in doing research, realizing like just how prominent the Puerto Rican, I had known the Puerto Rican population was really prominent, but just like the history of the Puerto Rican population in building Philadelphia. And although there are Dominicans there now and have been there for a while, like Puerto Ricans were just the primary Latinx group there. And it felt like if I chose to write a Dominican character or even a half Dominican character, it would be out of fear. It would be out of fear because my instinct was, I think there is a story here to honor the group that came to mind initially, and the students that I met who were mostly Puerto Rican and Black American, but I'm too afraid because it's a group outside of what I know at home, right? Like I know, but from a distance. And so then I had to sit with myself and challenge that and think through, well, what kind of research would I need to do to feel like I understood, and where were the lines where maybe this, okay, that I don't really want to talk about that because I don't know enough about these political aimings or this particular demographic in Puerto Rico, but maybe I can talk about this. And so I did a lot of research, talked to homegirls, have visited Puerto Rico. My mom worked in Puerto Rico for a while as a nanny and as a cook. And so was just asking her questions about dishes or how she learned certain things to cook or what it was like to be from DR, what were some differences so that I could just like note what my instincts would be in a difference in that cultural element. So that was probably what I was most nervous by. It was just like, oh man, Boricuas are going to cancel me because I'm right, or getting at the level of the slang, at the level of, Dominicans point with their mouths, like do Puerto Ricans do that? Is that a Caribbean thing? Like wanting to know, wanting to feel like in my bones, I got the character and her family. And so that was probably where I put the most pressure on myself. I would say that I read The Fault in Our Stars years ago. And I remember being like, yo, it's so cool that like these white kids get to travel to Amsterdam. And so with The Fire on High, it was kind of like, you know what, my kids are going to travel. Like they're going to see things like, yeah, we're going to go get out. And I had, when I thought of it, I'm like, oh, I actually don't know that I've read a book where students travel abroad, right? or students of color travel abroad, and where they are in another country and you see the wonder and the experience and the complexity of your first time out of your block, much less your state and country, right? And then that felt really intriguing, like that instead of it being chopped or a competition, which I had already done in the Poetics, but also we often tell our young people that the only way out is through competition, that this allowed for a different kind of story. Like, no, there is enrichment in just leaving what you're comfortable with and then returning and seeing what happened. And I really wanted to kind of think through that, right? And writing this book made me think through, okay, what does it mean to be 17 and experiencing a part of the world that your parents have never even experienced, that your hood doesn't know? So that was the research and a lot of the things there. And I had studied in Spain when I was in high school and had gone back several times. So I also just think Sevilla is gorgeous and complicated. And every time I look at the gold, I'm like, you're beautiful and you're probably from my island. And so it's like, how do I feel about this place? And it felt cool to be like, well, how does Imani feel about this place? Yeah.
That's an interesting point. An interesting point that you bring up about competition, because I feel like a lot of the time an easy critique to make of anything is like, what are the stakes? And a lot of the time people think the solution is competition, right? Because it's such a plain sort of way.
You have to win a thing against someone else.
And there's a moment. Do you win? Do you not? And then you understand losing, or winning. So it's all clued in, and I love that you didn't go with that. And
it also gives us a hero story, right? Like, sorry? It gives us an easy hero story.
Yeah, exactly.
We love heroes, the one. And so when they win, they're the one. And with this book, it was interesting to be like, oh, what is community? How does community come through? And that it's several. It's not the one, it's a group of us. And we're graduating as a unit, and that's really important. And our family, like that, it was a very communal book, which I think is, going back to the original question, one of the things that prose allows was a lot more characters, right? A lot more dialogue, a lot more emailing and FaceTiming and these kinds of things that happen in the real world, but in verse would feel, I think, jarring, almost like, how do I keep track of this phone conversation that in prose is a lot clearer? So the world was bigger and I could make it feel communal. There are a lot more voices, the barbershop people, the people who work at the restaurant, and so I love the expansiveness that prose allows.
That is true, yeah. And you have just more words.
There was also 50,000 more words.
Yeah. Great. All right, well, let's move on to Clap When You Land. Your return to novels in verse. I guess the obvious question here is like, how do you write two protagonists both in verse and make them distinct from each other? And I think I've heard you talk about this before, but I'm like, tell me again, because I forgot.
I mean, I think that is the big question, Aaron, that I kept asking myself, like, are they distinct? I don't know. I mean, it would help to know, and you probably know this, but for listeners, that the first draft of Clap When You Land was only written from one character's perspective. So the sister that lives in New York was telling the entire story. And in a conversation again with Ibiza Boy, who we were signed to the same agency. And so we were often talking about like, what is, early publishing, what are we doing? What's happening? We would talk about our books pretty often. I'm telling her this story, and we share an island, right? Ibi is from Haiti. My parents are from the Dominican Republic. And so I'm telling her this story that's, largely thinking about the Dominican Republic. And she kind of pushed at me and was like, why don't we get the other sibling? Like, I feel like that's probably the sibling that is often silenced in real life, right? Who doesn't have the privilege and access and platform that you might get in the United States. And so I think going back to the choices, right, that are craft choices, but are also, what are we saying? It's like, oh, how am I doubling down on a silencing there? And so I had to step back. And that very night after we had that conversation, I wrote the first poem in the book, Mud, and thinking of this character in DR who has to walk through hurricane season. And so it's super muddy. And then that character took off. And Camino was one of the dopest characters I've ever written. I would be writing her and be like, oh, she is about to go in. Like, she just felt so fierce to me and so alive to me. And just like all these chamaquitas in DR that just be out here, like hustling and grinding and like figuring a way out of no way, right? I was lucky enough to work as Sosua at a foundation for young women, mainly to send them to school so that they don't get caught up in sex work before they are able to make that choice of their own volition. And so I could kind of think through all these young women and just like how they moved, right? But then I realized that first character I'd written was whack in comparison. Like, she just was she wasn't as interesting. She wasn't as sassy. So the book felt like very much like I would write one and then I'd write this one. Then I'd be like, oh, I got to bring this one up. And it was this like step ladder almost of trying to get them both to have important stakes and interesting things to say and conflicts that were internal and external and really complicated. In terms of the voice, I mean, there are things that you'll notice. One sister's written in tercets and is very much staccato, is very clipped, very New York, very like, we're going to talk quick and we're going to talk sharp and we're going to get zingers off. And then you have a character who's written in couplets and is a little bit more flowy. There's less punctuation. Her language is very idiom ridden, which if you go to DR, you're gonna get a saying for everything. Everything has a saying, and there's a dicho for this and a dicho for that. Yeah. So that comes through a little bit more clearly. It's in the language of their worlds. So the machetes, the chickens, the altar, the saints comes through in Camino's imagery, that this is the world that she knows. Yahaira is talking more of the skyscrapers, of concrete, of firescapes, which is the world that she knows. So that's what she's using to kind of visualize certain things. So that was how I tried to navigate voice at a very craft level of, okay, how do I actually make their meter, their beat, how they speak completely different from each other, because the novel was written kind of in a back and forth. And so I made a lot of those choices after the fact.
Yeah, it's wild that you're like, oh, I don't know if I accomplished that. Of course you did. And I'm like, they're two very different people. I also just I'll say this now, like, sorry, I was spoiling things earlier. I don't know if you're watching this talk, you should have read all of Elizabeth's books. I'm sure a lot of people have. But this is a definite spoiler for Clap When You Land. So if you want to,
I love this. Cover your ears because this is for sure.
Yeah, I mean, this is like the literal, end of the book. But this isn't a question, it's just a comment. And I love, I told you too about the sunlight, that it was going to go out midway.
I've been watching it fading. I'm like, wow.
Great metaphor for life. Right. I just love it at the end of the book. And I was very conscious of this, like it was all women saving, and it's not even like a kind of manufactured Marvel moment where it's like all these women, like girl power, girl boss sort of thing. It's like, in yours, that's the reality. It's like when you look at life, it's usually women defending other women, especially like in the Latinx community. It's like there's that sort of family aspect of it that's not just for family. And so I really appreciated that. And then rereading Poetics when X is the only one defending herself. It's like, that's not just that's how she had to be. And it's like, there's something so real about that. And like the women in my life, they're so more protective of me than any man has ever been. And it's just, I was just thinking about Clappity Land, like the ending. I'm like, oh, it felt so earned.
Yeah. That scene came before a lot of the book had been written. I kind of, in my head, was like, all the books have at some point like a convening, like there's the coven comes together. I would say in all of them, there's the moment where like, all right, everyone has to come to the altar and like have a reckoning. But with that book, it was such a physical, like, I don't know how I'm going to get this character out of this. And I'm scared for her as the writer, because I might have to make choices in order for it to feel inevitable that are going to be such hard choices. But it was, it can only happen if every character with their individual power, right? Like an actual power, right? Like their ability to wield and to navigate political systems has to be present, and witness, right? The potential for violence. And then decide we are going to choose something different for this young woman. We are going to protect her. And I think it's probably one of the most powerful statements I've ever made. There are so few men in that book, right, at all. And I think, and it's completely purposeful that we don't, right, have any men really talk except for El Cero and Don Mateo, like and the uncle. Like it's so specific that these women speak up and hold it down, and with machetes or with connections, figure it out. So I'm glad you really thought it was a great scene. I think of it as like my Marvel scene.
Yeah, no,
like closest to a Marvel scene I've ever written.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you have a new piece coming out May 3rd. I was very lucky to get an advance copy, Inheritance. I was looking it up. There are videos of you sort of doing spoken word and poems and stuff, but there isn't one of you doing Inheritance, which I really wanted to see. But can you talk about this poem?
Yeah. So Inheritance, if you want to see the early poem this is based off, you're going to want to look for it under the name Hair, because it's not the same.
Oh, okay. I see.
The same title. So the poem Hair, which is not particularly creatively titled, was about my relationship with, kind of internal colorism and racism, and what it's like to grow up in a Caribbean diaspora like one from the Dominican Republic, where there's also been this self-hatred that has been taught. Right. And the Dominican Republic, as the first place colonized by Spain or by a European power on this side of the world, I think has had such a long history of being taught that, like, the whiter you are, the paler you are, the straighter your hair, the bluer your eyes, like the more successful you'll be. And it's become such an indoctrinated idea. And so I remember having a conversation with my mom when I was in college, and bringing up my boyfriend at the time, my now husband, who is very dark-skinned Black American man, and her inability to realize how certain things she said were prejudice. Like, she just thought, no, this is just the facts of life. It is easier for two oppressed people to be with white people than to be with each other, because it is, like, literally just, they're going to have more work than they would if they were in a relationship where culturally they were either closer, like Latinx with Latinx, or where someone had more affinity to power. And so you were going to be losing power by being in that partnership. And I struggled with the fact that, like, this was so internalized. Like, she couldn't even see how, as a fair-skinned woman who had married a darker-skinned man, or how her mother was a dark-skinned woman who had married a fair-skinned man, like how this was, like, you're talking literally about your family. You're talking about your own choices. You're talking to your child, who in many spaces is read as Black American, and is definitely read as being of the Afro diaspora. Like, you're telling her, like, this is where you sit. And it was a hard conversation. It's been several hard conversations throughout the years. And so I would perform this poem, kind of my response to my mother. And it was such a war cry. And it was so much anger and resentment that so much had been taken away from me, that I had to write my own ode to remind myself that, like, how I came into the world was enough. And despite how much I had been challenged to straighten my hair and to put a clothespin on my nose and just align to whiteness, that I could reject that.
Yeah. Well, it's a beautiful poem, and it's also has like such
Was that
beautiful.
better? What happened?
Oh, I think you faded out a little bit, and then I started talking, and then you started talking, and
Oh,
then
oh,
yeah. But
oh.
sorry, what were you saying?
That I got really tired of performing this poem that felt like it like the conversations I had with my mom, the ways that I had grown, the ways that she had grown, but also the what I wanted from this poem um, was dated, you know. And after 10 years, after 12 years, it's kind of like I am repeating something that I am no longer connected to that story in that way, that I feel like I've done really important work and I would write this differently. I feel like she's done really important work and would have approached that conversation differently. And so I reached out to my editor and mentioned that I had this poem that was really popular, that I loved. And I wanted to think about how to make it, instead of a war cry, like an invitation. That I wanted the young women who reach out to me and are like, because of you, I don't straighten my hair anymore, or this poem was what I needed to share with my mom. Like, those women are potentially having children now, or have nieces now, or have cousins now. I want them to read this with them and it be loving. Like, this is now our poem. Now we are talking to a they that and that was a different audience than what it had been before. And so I think that there's a tenderness to this version that feels really good, and that they both exist, right? So if you need the war cry, you get that. And if you need something gentler, you get that too. They're very similar, but it's just like very little word changes that I felt like allowed for it to be closer to where I am now.
Yeah, awesome. I was just gonna say it's a beautiful poem, and there's
Thanks.
beautiful art by
Artwork is amazing. Yeah.
Did you have any input on the drawings, or was that all Andrea?
I had input on how we ultimately ended up selecting the artists. And so I got to look at a lot of the different art forms and incredible artists that submitted work. But because the story felt like we wanted to talk about tradition and history, you know, she did that one image with the hair, and then the hair has the ship. And I was like, oh, that's it. Yeah. Yeah.
Because of the lighting, but
I mean, you literally have the slave ship in her hair. And I was like, this is on another level of like how you carry something and how she was visualizing. It's also graphic. So it felt very like my hip hop roots, my like very brash. Sometimes you just need to say something how it needs to be said, like the ways colored work. I just felt like she got it, you know. And she's an OG. Like, she's been illustrating forever. She's like really good at her job. So I trusted her with the work, but there was very little input on my end. Like, I know sometimes people work with the illustrator and this is what I want here. This is what the image should look like. Like, she came with stuff and I was like, yeah, that looks about right. That looks pretty good. So I was, it was very straightforward to work with each other.
Yeah. No, the shipwrecked hair that image was the one that I saw, and I'm like, literally, I thought next level. Like, I was like, wow, like it's just a strong statement, you know, artistic statement. It was incredible.
Yeah. I was so lucky to work with her, and I think it's going to be a beautiful book that hopefully people will want to share with each other.
Yeah,
that's my biggest.
All right, so we've talked about all the books. Yay! Now we can sort of talk about writing more in general. I had to get all my questions about the books individually out first. But right, so you write spoken word poems, novels in verse, novels in prose. We talked about sort of the inspiration drop-ins or downloading.
Scripts.
Sorry?
Scripts.
Oh, you write scripts too?
Well, with the Fire on High and Clap When You Land are both being adapted by me, apparently. So I've written the pilot episode for Clap When You Land and the film script, early film script for With the Fire on High. But that I won't claim. I'm still learning. But I did, since we're saying the other kinds of writing, I just wanted
to... I didn't know that. I'm so glad I know that. Wow, yeah, just throw in screenwriting too, just for funsies. No, that's
totally like just ruined your whole question or whatever you were about to say. But
well, I was just gonna say, I'm like, do you have another hour so that we can talk exclusively about screenwriting? I'm like, oh my gosh, now I have so many questions. No, but so I don't know if, because you're adapting, screenplays, like, I don't know if this question will apply, but I was curious about, like, when you get the inspiration, like, how do you sort of figure out which avenue to go into, right? If you get a really great idea, about, like your hair and, internalized colorism, like, are you thinking like, oh, book, spoken word, verse, like, how do you make that decision?
Yeah. This is always one of the hardest questions for me because I want it to be a really tangible answer that people will be able to use, but it does feel incredibly instinctual to me.
Mm-hmm.
Like something I will think of a line and I'll kind of know like, oh, there's rhythm there, or I'm thinking of the next line and I know like, oh, there's a poem, right? Like the way that I am observing this thing that is happening has music to it, right? And so I know that's probably a poem. And sometimes I'll think of something, I'm like, that's a really cool idea. I don't think I can push that any further. And it's like, that's probably just a tweet, right? Like there's it's not really going anywhere else. It's a single insight that, is cute, right? And so that belongs here. I have sat down before to write prose and ended up realizing, this is actually verse. It is the movement of the language is doing something else. And I've sat down and tried to write, a poem, and it's a prose poem, or it ends up being prose because I realize I need the structure of the sentence to help me encapsulate the thought, right? And so I need a little bit more structure because the thought is doing too much, or the world is going to become too big, like in the case of with the Fire on High, where I need more characters. So I actually am going to need containers for this that won't exist in poetry, or won't be it would be less easy. I don't know, I can't think. It would be more difficult to try to contain this in verse. And right now I just need to get it out. So I feel like all of these are just different containers, and I just kind of got to figure out what belongs where, what goes into what Tupperware. And I feel like we all do that. Like we eye it and we're like, all right, that's going to go in the big one. That's going to go over here. This lemon fits in a little pouch. And that's how it really does feel for me. Like, how big is this thing? How much word count is it going to need? And then that kind of lets me know, okay, well, then it's going to go in this shape. But it is very much like an instinct of what my writerly self, which I think is often more developed than my person self, right? Like my writer self has a outpaces me all of the time. And it's like, what we can do next is this. And so that I trust my writer self to have great instincts and to be very thoughtful about form. And I don't know if that's just having studied poetry. So you study form over and over, and like, what is the best form? Is it a ghazal? Is it a sonnet? Is it free verse? And you make that choice over and over. What's the best form for this group of words to the content to match the craft and really get this thing across? And so it feels very natural to just look at everything as, okay, what's the form? And that's one of the first questions I answer. I don't know. Was that helpful?
Yeah, no, I think
study poetry. That's my answer. People study poetry if they want to figure out where to put where, because form.
Yeah. No, I think even when, a writer like you says it's instinctual, you sort of give permission to other writers to be like, because if I have an instinct for like, oh, I think this is a poem or this is a novel or whatever, like I'm still going to sort of be like, well, I'm sure there's a perfect way to figure out how I can use this. But it's like, if it's instinctual, I can just be like, oh, then it's this. Because Elizabeth Acevedo said that I can just go with my gut.
There's a knowing, and like there's also no fault in. I've written things entirely in third person, 70,000 words, and then had to go in and be like, oh, I think this is first person, and then had to rewrite the whole thing in first person, right? I've written an entire novel from one character's perspective, and then be like, oh, we need a whole second character. Like the text needs what it needs, and so I think being resistant to what in your heart as a creator, like, oh, it's not working, and I think I have to try something else. Like, one, writing is just experimentation. Like there's no way you can download from your brain onto the paper and get it perfectly. But two, like that is the work. It is making those choices of something isn't sitting right. I have to try another avenue in. And so I guess I even when the form, I think I know it and I follow that instinct, and then that instinct is wrong. Like, all right, well, like I have to do service to this project. And it doesn't care that my instinct was wrong, or that was the instinct I needed to get all of this on paper. And now I need to do something different with this material. Like, I don't know. I just have no qualms with, like, yeah, you write the thing and then you figure out what the hell it's trying to tell you, and then you put it in the shape and the way that you need it. And that is literally the writing.
Yeah.
So lots of permission.
Just all the permission. I'm going to throw another artistic medium at you. Narration. So I don't know how I knew, but I sort of was like, oh, I think she narrated the Poetics, and then I looked it up and you did, and then I looked up Clap and You Land, and you did did one of the characters, I think,
Yes,
right?
Yes.
Yeah. And so that's something I've never talked to anyone about, but like how, besides having like a naturally beautiful voice like you do, like what are the things that you do as a narrator to make a good audiobook?
Yeah, thank you for complimenting my voice. I too think I have a fantastic voice. And I walked into my little meeting like, so when I do the narration, they were like, you have to audition.
Yeah.
Which I love. I love that they were just like, you and everybody else has to get online and but I really do enjoy narration. I enjoy it as a writer because often when I'm narrating the books, there's still the possibility of small edits. So I catch a ton when I'm doing the audiobook because we're still not at print. We're months out of print. So it's almost like my last revision process is reading the book out loud and realizing like, oh, is this working? Is this working? Like, oh, I actually think this word would be better. So it gives me one last opportunity to hear the entire thing in a matter of 2 or 3 days, right? And very few of us sit down and like record an entire audiobook just for editing purposes. So I have this like piece of me that's also just like walking into the room as the writer and like, okay, today we're going to do our last revision, right? By saying this out loud. But as a narrator, I do prepare. I try to read all the passages that I'm going to be narrating the next day and try to practice my dialogue and my voices. You have to be really thoughtful about like the mom sounds at a higher pitch and can I like replicate that again and again? The dad sounds at this lower pitch and I have to know how to like get that across. The best friend has to have this kind of voice. And they're just like these really small, subtle choices, but that you have to repeat and memorize, right? And so it's really interesting work. I think it teaches my ear how to listen and how to get even closer to my own voice. Because sometimes I'll read something and I'm like, what was I trying to do here? It doesn't sound how I think it should sound. Right. And so then I get even more specific with, okay, well, what was it I thought this sounded like? And what is it that I want it to do now? So I find it really, really valuable. And reading someone else's work, I read Pride for Ibiza Boy, and reading her and like being like, oh, these sentences are different than my own. And like in someone else's head in how they construct a story and language. And then I'm fighting my own instincts of what I want to do, but it's teaching me at a very like fundamental level how a writer crafts, right? Because I'm listening to her cadence and her, so I find narration just like so generative, and it's the most exhausting thing I do. Like you go in for 8 hours straight, you sit there, you do lunch, you have breaks, but it's like you're sitting in a booth with these headphones, you're reading the same paragraph, you can't get this word across, and nope, do it again, nope, do it again. Okay, let's stop and come back to this section because I don't think you hit it, right? And someone else telling you that you're not reading your own work the way it's meant to sound, and you're like, do you know who and having to trust someone else and be like, all right, I am trusting that you as a listener have information about this that because I'm so close to it, I can't hear. So let me try again. So it's really interesting work. I hope that if you're able to read your own, hopefully without auditioning that, but I think I want to do that even if I'm not narrating. I want to record to myself all of my books so that I have that experience of like hearing the text.
Yeah, it's, oh my God, that's so funny. I do have an audition to read, but I kind of just did it because it's something that I thought about, but I don't have any experience with like doing that. So I just kind of wanted to have the story of doing that. But it's funny too, like whenever I read poetry or novels in verse, I read it out loud. I don't just,
Yes.
so I have to be home. So I read the Poetics like yesterday and today out loud, and I'm trying to do like this Yomada voice, and I'm trying to do, her dad was the easiest.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't say a lot, but and just, you see all the rhythm of it. And I tell my students, I'm like, reading out loud is the best way to edit. Like you catch things.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, we are very sadly out of time. I had a ton of more questions.
So fast.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, you're just so full of wisdom, and you're
You're too kind. I can't wait for the world to meet Quique and his love interests and his dreams and how he's like in the world. I mean, so excited that our books and our characters will live like alongside each other.
Oh, thank you so much. And
it's funny alongside each other because our names are probably going to be on
books. Oh my God, yeah, no, we basically have the same last name. That's amazing. It's funny, I would go to bookstores and I would look like, where would my book be? And yours was always right there. And I
got a spot for you, homie. Come through, right next to me.
But like, I forgot about that as like, it became a reality.
Isn't that beautiful?
So weird. But oh my gosh, thank you so much. So that's all the time we have. I want to thank Elizabeth Acevedo once again for joining us. You can order her books. I think we have links somewhere. Should be a box, something. But A Story Bookshop is hosting us. Order from them if you can. They're so great to always have us. I want to thank Laura for hosting us. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. If you would like to see previous Shop Talks featuring the award-winning best-selling authors Adib Karam, Leah Johnson, Abdi Nazemian, Elsie Rosen, Arvin Ahmadi, Mark Rashiro, Jason June, Robbie Couch, Isaac Fitzsimons, Kyle Lukov, Ryan Douglas, and Aidan Thomas, you can find those recordings on A Story of Bookshop's YouTube channel. Anything else you'd like to say, Elizabeth?
No, I'm just so thankful I've been with you all and for this space. Thank you so much, Aaron.
This was lovely. Thank you all. Bye.
Wow.
Have a great